Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Planet Tracker IPR webinar. My name is Peter Elwin. I'm head of the Food and Land Use Programme at Planet Tracker and Director of Fixed Income, and I'm very pleased to be welcoming you to this exciting webinar. We're delighted to be celebrating the launch of the Inevitable Policy Response's latest report, which shows that progress on nature and land use will ultimately make or break net zero efforts. The IPR report published today forecasts that half of global emissions reductions by 2035 are set to come from the land use sector through a combination of policies to end deforestation, lower agricultural emissions, reduce food waste, restore degraded natural ecosystems, and scale nature-based solutions. And policymakers are waking up to the critical role of nature, land, and food in reaching their climate goals. The number of material and credible national policy announcements has doubled in the last 12 months compared to the previous year, according to the IPR's analysis, including significant shifts in China, the EU, and Brazil. And this just underlines that a land use transition is undertaking now, which is as significant as the energy transition. So we're really delighted to have a number of experts to join us on this webinar. Just in terms of housekeeping, before we get into the details, do use the Q&A facility to ask questions. We've got quite a crowded agenda, but if we have time, we'll address them during the webinar. But otherwise, if you put them into the Q&A box, then we can get back to you afterwards with answers as appropriate. And this webinar will be recorded, or is being recorded, and it will be available on Planet Tracker's YouTube channel tomorrow. Now, as I say, we've got a plethora of experts to discuss these issues. I'll introduce them as we go through rather than doing them all up front. But really, I'd love to kick off the webinar today by introducing our keynote speaker. I'm delighted that Patricia Espinosa is able to join us today, this afternoon. Patricia is chair of GFANZ Latin America and a former executive secretary of the UN Climate Change. She's a founding partner and CEO of 1.5 and has more than 35 years of experience at the highest level in diplomacy, multinational negotiations, and international relations. So, Patricia, we're really delighted to have you here today and really looking forward to your keynote address. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. And I do want to start by thanking the Inevitable Policy Response and Planet Tracker for inviting me to take part in this important discussion on global trends in response to the mounting risks faced by nature and their implications. This is a subject that I care deeply about. I spent 6 years at the head of the UNFCCC and decades working as a diplomat to promote sustainable development and in particular to strengthen the global climate change architecture. And I now head a consultancy firm, 1.5, that specializes in advising businesses, non-governmental organizations, and governments on their sustainability strategies. The transition to a net zero world is not an easy job, but we now have better instruments than just a few years ago. We have a robust framework backed up by science with clear principles and collectively defined goals. It may not be perfect, but it is certainly solid and sound enough to drive decisive, transformative action. Climate action has been steadily gaining momentum. Governments around the world are waking up to the critical role of nature, deforestation, and food systems as they seek to deliver on joint climate, biodiversity, and sustainable development goals. In the last 12 months, the number of material and credible policy announcements on nature and land use have doubled compared to the previous year, according to the analysis that IPR will be presenting today. This marks a significant shift for major economies, with the analysis showing over 90% of the nature-related policy developments tracked in the last year are in line with a pathway to a well below 2-degree temperature outcome, which is the upper limit of the Paris Agreement. Those necessary developments create significant risks for unprepared investors and companies who have yet to eliminate deforestation from their supply chains and portfolios. At the same time, they set the stage for growing opportunities for those who are investing in nature-based solutions, which will only continue to grow rapidly. But despite this progress, we are still far from where we need to be. The analysis shows policy developments do not go far enough to put the world on a pathway to 1.5 degrees. This goal was reaffirmed by nearly 200 governments at the UAE-hosted COP28. The latest science from the IPCC, which uses 2019 as a baseline, concluded that greenhouse gas emissions need to be cut 43% by 2030 if we are to limit the temperature rise to 1.5. The gap to get there is still huge, and time is running out. Every fraction of a degree of temperature rise is a matter of life and death to millions, especially in the developing world. Today, I will talk about some of the progress I have seen firsthand in recent years, and also where we can and will go further in coming years. Climate action has been hampered in recent years due to a succession of international crises: the COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine, US-China tensions, the war in Gaza, and the spiraling rise in the cost of living in many regions, to name but a few. No year since the adoption of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has been free of significant global political or economic challenges. As a former Secretary of Foreign Affairs of my country, I would be the first to acknowledge the critical importance of all those issues. But as former head of the UNFCCC, I am also quick to point out that they cannot be used as excuses to postpone ambitious and effective climate action. The most recent climate change conference held in Dubai last year produced positive outcomes on all three fronts. Having organized 5 of those global conferences, I can tell you that no COP leaves everyone feeling satisfied with its outcomes. But I believe that the results from COP28 should be seen both as a source of encouragement and a call to action. They point the way ahead for government policy, corporate strategy, and civil society engagement as the world responds to the unfolding climate crisis. This is true across the entire scope of climate action, but it is perhaps more clearly seen in the case of nature and land use, the issue that is at the heart of today's discussion. Accounting for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, transforming food systems is at the core of the global response to climate change, including nature-based solutions. The COP28 UAE Declaration on Agriculture, Food, and Climate put forward a set of priorities to promote sustainable agriculture and food systems in response to climate change. At the end of the conference, it had received endorsements from 158 countries. In Dubai, private and public stakeholders also committed to strengthening their efforts to halt deforestation and boost recovery and resilience initiatives. This is a critical task, as deforestation accounts for 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions, surpassing aviation and cement production. Key announcements include the Forest and Climate Leaders Partnership and the International Climate and Forest Initiative, which set ambitious goals with clear principles and actions. Private sector companies must invest in nature and the transformation of food systems, both to counter the increasing risks that extreme weather events pose to the viability of food and other natural resources, and above all, to seize the opportunities brought upon by innovative and more sustainable practices on this field. Change is coming and not a moment too soon. And this is especially true about the region I call my own, which is Latin America and the Caribbean. This is a region of vital importance to the world, as it sustains an unparalleled diversity of plant and animal species, with an estimated 60% of the globe's terrestrial life in 6 of the world's 17 most biodiverse countries. We at 1.5 recently carried out a study on the main challenges of climate action in the region and found that regrettably, but not surprisingly, unsustainable economic growth and social inequity are putting huge pressures on the region's natural resources. Agricultural intensification and expansion of land for commodity production continues to encroach on natural habitats. I have been able to see personally ravaged forest areas in Central America and Southern Mexico, and the images have stayed with me over the years. Latin America and Caribbean countries urgently need to adopt a new development path, one predicated on sustainability, circularity, and above all, equity. We are, fortunately, at a moment of courageous leadership in the region. Brazil currently chairs the G20 and is placing the sustainability agenda at the heart of the group's deliberations throughout the year. And Latin America will also host 2 critical conferences over the next 2 years. COP16 of the UN Convention on Biodiversity, hosted by Colombia, and the UNFCCC's COP30 that will be held in Brazil in 2025. Brazil is leading by example. With over 60% of the Amazon forest, the Brazilian government launched the Tropical Forest Forever Fund, which calls for $250 billion per year to finance forest conservation with support from diverse stakeholders. And global efforts are underway to mobilize investments in support of nature-based solutions, which provide an enormous opportunity for climate, people, nature, and economic prosperity. In my capacity as chair of the GFANZ Latin America and Caribbean Advisory Board, this is one of my priorities over the coming years. With just under 7 years to go before the end of this decade, accelerating the transition to a net zero economy is our greatest challenge. 3 major tasks stand out. From the political side, focusing on the collective long-term benefits of international agreements rather than narrowly understood short-term national interests. From the business side, coming up with concrete and comprehensive plans that turn good intentions into clear commitments with verifiable outcomes. From public institutions, private entities, and the public at large, active engagement to bring about change with the sense of urgency that scientific evidence demands. The formal decisions adopted by the COP are shaping national policy and governance across the world. Investors need to understand the way decisions translate into policy and regulations in the countries where they operate. This is the only way to avoid regulatory risk and, perhaps more importantly, to identify new economic opportunities derived from the transition underway in agriculture and the conservation of nature. Climate action is then an economic imperative and a major investment opportunity. Imperative because climate change represents a systemic risk that threatens economic activities across the whole value chain. An opportunity because the new circular economy that is in the making will favor those who make the transition to sustainable development and growth. The 1980s saw the beginning of a global trend in favor of greater economic openness, free trade, and global markets. Policies and legislations across the world evolved over the next couple of decades as countries sought to align their economic strategies to the global paradigm. A similar trend is well underway across the world. Only this time, it seeks to address the environmental fallout of the previous economic model and to put the world on a path to sustainable economic growth. The business environment will change beyond recognition over the next years. The process has started. In addition to the positive developments on nature, land use, and sustainable food systems, which we will hear about today, we have seen greater commitments and action in areas such as the just energy transition, adaptation and resilience, green cities and the built environment, sustainable transport, and most importantly, finance and other means of implementation. Investors willing to meet today's climate and nature challenges head-on, considering both the risks and opportunities, are the ones who will be able to reap the greatest rewards in the immediate future. In doing so, they will be joining the cause of nature. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Patricia. Stirring words and very important ones. And I love that framing of sustainability, circularity, and equity. It sounds like a modernization of the French national motto, but I think it's a great banner that we can all align ourselves with. And the point that you make about investors needing to really engage with the process that is inevitable and is currently going on, absolutely crucial. So thank you very much indeed. I'd now like to hand over to two experts from the Inevitable Policy Response and Deloitte, who've been working on this report, to discuss the findings from the IPR's latest report, which looks at policy trends across land use and nature. So if I can introduce both of them, welcome to Kavita Srinivasan, who's the head of operations at the Inevitable Policy Response. And Kavita has a diverse background in climate, energy, and land use, with over 15 years of experience advising governments, utilities, and other clients on climate policy and decarbonization strategies. So welcome, Kavita. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. And we're also privileged to have Dr. Nicole Röttmer. Nicole is Managing Director, Deloitte Sustainability and Climate. She has more than 20 years of experience advising companies on their sustainable transformation. And both of them have longer biographies, but I won't talk them through on the webinar in the interest of time. But if you want to know more about their backgrounds, do go onto the registration page and see the details. So Kavita and Nicole, thank you very much indeed for taking the time. I will hand over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Patricia, and the other panelists today. I'll start walking through a few slides that everyone should see, setting the scene on what the Inevitable Policy Response is before handing over to Nicole. So next slide, please. And one more. So the Inevitable Policy Response, or IPR for short, was started in 2018 to really help investors incorporate climate risk into their portfolio assessment. IPR is a broad research partnership together with energy transition advisors, GFANZ Labs, and Deloitte, as well as others who collaborate along with funders and strategic partners from the investment community. So next slide, please. And one more, thank you. So for several years now, IPR has set out realistic energy and land transition scenarios, asking what are the major climate policies that are likely to come about in the 2020s. We've just heard this decade is critical and beyond. And then we quantify the impact of these policies on the real economy and on emissions in an integrated scenario. And so a few things that really differentiate IPR scenario from other climate scenarios in the market. First, as mentioned, IPR is grounded in an extensive assessment of likely policy trajectories in both the near and long term across all major economies in the world. This results in a set of, we see here, 300 high conviction policy forecasts. Second, other scenarios are often based on a temperature constraint, and they kind of work backwards. How do we meet this objective? As a result, for investors or other analysts, when they're looking at the pathways for decarbonization in key sectors, they often appear hypothetical, less transparent, how they will likely unfold in practice. And then third, uniquely and importantly for today's discussion, IPR brings together energy, land, and nature in an integrated scenario. I think this is important, and we'll see some of the implications later on. So bringing this together, IPR has developed what we call the forecast policy scenario, which is aligned with achieving a well under 2-degree climate objective, around 1.7 to 1.8. And we publish a detailed database on the IPR website. This is open access, covers over 4,000 variables, includes detailed assumptions and outputs for the land and nature sectors. Then go to the next slide, please. So this tipping point slides has been around for a while, but I thought important to share again today on this webinar. That is, IPR believes that growing awareness and momentum on climate issues, as well as increased physical risks due to climate change, makes a near-term forceful policy response inevitable. We also take into account critical technology and market forces that really facilitate these policy shifts. And we do a deep dive in each of these drivers in developing the forecast and scenario. And again, more details can be found on the IPR website and various publications. So if we move to the next slide, and this is just, I'll say it less eloquently than Patricia, this decade is really critical to get us on the path to 2050. Notably in 2025, countries will need to resubmit their climate pledges as part of the process established by the Paris Agreement. And so we see two major upcoming milestones in land and nature. Again, Patricia mentioned these. This year, countries will convene at the Biodiversity COP in Colombia, and they will review progress and actions towards meeting, the global diversity framework, which is established in 2022, a really important milestone. Second, COP30 in 2025 will take place in Brazil, as we've heard, with a likely heightened focus on deforestation and land use as countries submit their updated round of climate pledges. We can move to the next slide, please. And one more. So here we see the trajectory of emissions under IPR's forecast policy scenario, or FPS, where greenhouse gas emissions fall by nearly 80% by 2050. Notably, when we integrate land and energy in the scenario, we really see how land plays a critical role. Land can be either a carbon source, as carbon is released from soils from conversion or burning of trees, or land can be a sink, sequestering carbon in soil and trees. Here we see that with the right policy incentives to really drive nature-based solutions and avoiding deforestation, land could become a significant carbon sink by the 2040s. We also see here agriculture emissions do fall due to improvements in livestock and crop efficiencies. And also we explore diet shift towards alternative proteins and also improvements, reductions in food waste across the globe. But overall, we do see the share of relative agriculture emissions growing. This is due to increased population, increased protein consumption, as well as due to rapid emissions reductions in the rest of the economy. Next slide, please. So this chart breaks down CO2 emissions reductions from various land-based approaches. And we see how avoided deforestation policies could reduce emissions by 1.8 gigatons in 2050. Agriculture practices to enhance carbon retention in soils or efficiencies could remove another 1.6 gigatons. And finally, restoration of natural forests and other ecosystems could remove 2.2 gigatons by 2015 in the IPR scenario. So collectively, this is well over 5 gigatons of removal or reductions, helping to drive down overall global emissions to around 11.5 gigatons, as we've seen in the previous slide. Next slide, please. So this is a rather detailed slide, but really tries to show the breadth and depth of the analysis that underpins the scenario. We see here all the major IPR policy forecasts relevant to the land and nature sectors across major economies. The key takeaways here really are, first, IPR is forecasting significant policy action this decade across many regions. Major economies will lead the way, but with ripple effects across the globe. Most notably, we're seeing deforestation-free supply chain policies, such as the EUDR, and emerging policies in other jurisdictions. I think critically, deforestation must end by the end of this decade. Of course, there are certain countries that may lag into the 2030s, and then there are also some early mover countries as well. But on the whole, 2030 remains an important milestone. We need to see robust policy to incentivize low carbon agriculture. As mentioned, we'd also like to see countries firming up their global diversity framework commitments vis-a-vis policy. And then finally, as Patricia alluded to, a massive scaling up in finance for nature-based solutions. So I'll stop here and hand over to Nicole. We'll talk a bit more about how IPR systematically tracks and assesses policy developments relative to the scenario, and as well as recent policy momentum in land and nature. Thank you.
Thanks again, Kavita. So if we move to the next slide, please. One more. Thank you. What you're seeing here is this incredible momentum that we've witnessed over the past year. So if we compare what has happened in the past 12 months relative to the 12 months before that, we see a doubling of policies, which is fabulous by itself. You see a light logic on top as well, so blue, green, and yellow, which is an indication of where there's some type of backtracking that we witnessed in the policies that were released, where there's confirmation of the forecast that has been presented by Kavita a moment ago, and where we do see acceleration. So there's a lot of green, which is absolutely positive. Another element that might come to mind, if you look at the timeline, the Q4s, that is linked to COP, right? Emphasizing further what Patricia has been illustrating, what Kavita just said. So the COP momentum that is coming up, at least in the past, has already shown that this is magnificent and this is really driving change in a manner that we haven't witnessed in climate in the past. So that's fabulous. We talked about the relevance of key markets taking the lead here. And what we've laid out here as well is where do you see major regulations that have come into play? So for example, starting with US Inflation Reduction Act, the EU legislation on deforestation free supply chains, UK, France, biodiversity market, EU land protection, but notably China, the Chinese Land Protection Act. And we'll get back to that in a moment. So the key question, if we move one slide ahead, the key question is, what does it mean? Just because there's a number of policies, it doesn't mean that it's good, right? So what we've done is looked at the analysis and the forecast that Kavita talked about and thought about how did this change with the policies that were released? So as I mentioned previously, where do we see acceleration? Where do we see maybe a step back in the market? And where do we see confirmation? So let me start with confirmation. So what you see on the right-hand side, the wonderful dark green, this is all confirmation, which is a really strong signal. You do see some blues. I just mentioned China, for example. So this idea around revitalizing 30% of the degraded land. And if you look at what the stock exchanges have been releasing, that is going to have some fundamentally stronger even ripple effects through the economy. We do look, for example, at the Indonesian initiative together with Norway on stopping deforestation, which is another positive element. And then in the US, the kind of deforestation, like the Forest Act. So again, limiting deforestation in the supply chain, regulating products that are linked to illegal deforestation. We do have some decelerations, unfortunately. One in Argentina, you might have seen that in December, the omnibus bill that is providing quite a backdrag on regulation that has already been in place, especially around lodging and burning of land. You do see it for Russia, so releasing logging restrictions around Lake Baikal, and which again gets us back to this question around how impactful is it and where does it pay into the carbon emission story that we're talking about. So if we move one slide ahead, what we've done is we've taken this analysis and brought it into this question of how many of these policies, if you translate them into an emissions impact, what is the impact of these policies on emissions? And is it positive, supportive, confirmatory, supportive, or even accelerating? So the key element is 2/3 of what we've seen in the forecast since the beginning of tracking is positive to the 1.5-degree temperature outcome, which again is a strong signal. We talked about emerging markets a moment ago, advanced economies, but still 90% positive regulations, and then in terms of emissions, even stronger supportive claims here. Let's take that into a financial actors view, right? In terms of what does it mean for risk assessments, what does it mean for market development? If we jump over the next slide and then to the content slide. Key elements from our perspective, page 17, please. Key elements from our perspective are, on the one hand, the supply chain side. It's the slide that says there are significant risks and opportunities. Lovely, adorable. So the first one is around supply chain risks that are increasing. What are we talking about? We're talking about major economies that have now come up with deforestation-free supply chain regulations, which basically are concerning Asia-Pacific, South America, East Africa, soybeans, cocoa, coffee, rubber, and beef, that are already, for the next 2 years, looking at kind of 7% of the value that might be lost if actors aren't prepared to mitigate for that regulation that is out there in major markets, so the US, UK, the EU. That's significant. There's a second element around nature-based solutions. We just talked about it. So nature-based solutions are coming into play. We do see significant support for that. A key number, and we look at that for another second in a moment, the 10-fold increase of NBS that might happen by 2035 if we look at the forecast that is currently into play. There's a last element around expanding carbon markets, which obviously have been under intense scrutiny in the past years for very good reasons in many instances. But just looking at the initiative of Brazil, we're looking at a market that could create a $220 billion offsetting potential for farming revenue losses moving forward. So significant momentum that we would expect to be taken up in other markets as well, linking back to the communication that we had about China a moment ago. Maybe 2 last points and deep dives. If we talk about land use, and you might remember this massive debate about what am I using land for, and we already see a question in the chat around that as well. The question is, A, where would land be used? What would land be used for in the future? And secondly, is there a conflict with other use cases? And can we manage the conflict with other use cases? So I already mentioned this number of a 10-fold increase along the forecast to 2030 of land that would be used for nature-based solutions. You see it on the slide in the kind of differentiation of use cases moving forward. And that is equivalent to around 10% of global agricultural land. So it's not a minor thing that we can just simply ignore at this point in time. If we would even think that this would come up with a market globally along 1.5, we're talking 1.8, and I'll get back to that in a moment, that could lead to a global market along a UNFI report of more than $670 billion by 2050. So again, significant market potential. Now, I promised to talk about land conflict, page 19, please. And this conflict element is relevant, right? If we look at the forecast and assume a decent transition, the supply gap that IPR is coming up with is around 1%. If we take the additional impact of climate change into account, it does increase naturally. So physical risks, obviously, it's a major point. But if we don't manage the transition properly, if we don't manage the land quality that we're talking about here, this is increasing up to 15% of a potential gap. And you can all imagine what that would mean. So you'd see a breakdown on the right-hand side. It's talking about baseline climate risks. It's talking about ecosystem risks that come on top, and it's talking about social and political risks, which are increasingly being taken account by NGFS, for example, etc. So yes, there might be a risk. This is a call for scrutiny and a call for a decent management of this land transition. And I think the political momentum that we're seeing is positive. Now, I'm not ending on a positive note because I have one last slide, which is around this 1.5 degree transition. And we've been talking about 1.8. So just this is providing you a map on where policies are accelerating, decelerating across different regions. We looked into that a moment ago. If we think about reaching 1.5, you see this on the right-hand side of this dark blue section, and it would basically mean that we would have to end deforestation basically immediately, so by 2025, right? So there's still quite a way to go, but we're still appreciative of the positive response and looking forward to the panel discussion in a moment. Peter, back to you.
Thank you, Nicole. That was a fantastic whistle-stop tour, and Kavita as well. And we have had a number of questions coming in about the IPR report in the chat and the Q&A. Do have a look at the report itself. It's got lots and lots more detail on things like bioenergy, on this whole business of sort of potential conflict for land and how that might be managed, and also discusses in a lot more detail, you know, why the IPR are assuming a particular pace of change, and you can get a better assessment yourselves from reading it as to whether that's in line with your assumptions. But again, going back to the basic sort of the theory of change, if you like, behind the IPR, it's designed for investors to have a clear view of what is likely, how governments are going to react to the sort of the joined up crises of nature and climate that they see before them. They won't be inactive, they will change things. So I'd like to turn now, after that fantastic summary of the report, to get the investor viewpoint from the last third sort of section of our webinar. A couple of expert panelists who are going to join me now. Andy Howard, who's the Global Head of Sustainable Investment at Schroders and a member of the firm's Group Management Committee. He's been at Schroders since 2016 and is responsible for the firm's sustainability strategy. So definitely somebody who's really down in the weeds as far as all this stuff is concerned. And he oversees the firm's sustainability thought leadership, ESG integration, and stewardship. And secondly, Nathan Fabian, who's the Chief Sustainable Systems Officer at the Principles for Responsible Investment, slightly confusing, the PRI as opposed to the IPR. So get the initials the right way around. And Nathan developed the PRI's Sustainable Financial Systems Program, and he was chair of the EU platform on sustainable finance that helped to develop the EU taxonomy, and he advises on sustainable finance regulation, as well as participating in a variety of expert groups across the EU and the UK. And so both of them taking time out of their very busy days to join me in this panel discussion. So thank you for that. Nathan, if I can turn to you first. Just thinking about the way that investor views are sort of evolving around nature and land use. I mean, how have investor views changed regarding nature, and what is their engagement with the topic and indeed with companies? How's that evolved over time? I mean, I suppose simply put, is nature as important as climate for investors?
Thanks, Peter. I think investors have been interested in some of the issues around nature for quite a while. But this tended to be a very isolated approach. I think that investors were working through the PRI on plastics, for example, plastic pollution almost a decade ago, perhaps more. So this singular issue, and I think pollution-focused view, has started to shift. And I think that's the basis of a more comprehensive approach from investors. Investors are now starting to see a more integrated system of land use, pollutants, circular economy, biodiversity. So starting to get the broader context. And of course, the idea that nature and climate solutions go together is definitely landing. Of course, investors, like governments in a way, rely on these big international agreements. And so the global biodiversity framework, which starts to set a peak target that then governments can implement and that investors can start to understand transition, provides an essential framework, if you like, for investors to respond to. And investors have been paying close attention. They have advocated in favor of strong target setting under the GBF. And so this indicates that investors are connecting to the issues here. What we're starting to see is that investors are treating nature like climate. Of course, the risk here is that climate activity has been stretched over a couple of decades, and we're going to have to do the nature-based incorporation into our activities in probably 4 or 5 years, not 20. And this is where the risk arises. Nonetheless, investors can give executive level oversight of nature as a risk, just like with climate. They can start to screen and assess portfolios. They can engage with high risk investees, and they can start to develop investment policies and strategies. And we're now starting to see this level of activity. But I think, as was already said, if we look at the gap here, potentially a $7 trillion market for investments in positive nature economy, and we're currently sitting at a minuscule, 200 billion. The gap in flows between where we are and where we need to be is still huge. So we just have a little bit more work to do to move this awareness of nature as a systemic issue into something that will make or break 1.5, as well as being a critical issue for ecosystem services for many industries.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. And that 7 trillion potential that you highlight, and the gap between that and what's currently invested is a really important point to sort of hang on to. Andy, if I can turn to you, I mean, looking potentially at that huge sort of opportunity, you know, you're down in the weeds, you're sort of at the coalface, if that's not the wrong analogy to use in a webinar about nature loss and climate change. But look, from your perspective, working for a large asset manager, I mean, how are financial institutions responding to nature risks, and how are they looking to unlock the opportunities, potentially to try and actually capture some of this 7 trillion that's out there?
Yeah, and look, it's hard to speak for the whole industry. I think to Nathan's point, there is a big spectrum. One thing that I definitely think, and I would very much agree, has changed is the level of focus on nature has significantly increased, particularly over the last few years. And bluntly, what used to be a conversation and a discussion and a somewhat descriptive narrative is increasingly becoming an analytical approach. There is more information, there is more data available. It's making it easier to actually approach this systematically and analytically, rather than just simply in more qualitative terms. I guess the first thing I'd say, I think nature biodiversity is not something over which we as asset managers or as investors broadly have a choice about whether we want to get exposure to or not. Look, we've all seen the numbers from whether it's the World Economic Forum or the OECD, whether it's half of the world's economy, whether it's 1.5 times the world economy. There is an intrinsic link between the economies, the industries, the companies, and the portfolios that we manage, and their dependency on nature. And that nature degradation, the biodiversity loss that we have seen over the last few decades, and which continues, makes all of us exposed. So I think our starting point really is, how do we think about nature loss and biodiversity exposures across all of the assets that we manage? And how do we put in place a framework, far from perfect, but there is now information, you can now approach that in a more structured way to understand where those dependencies and exposures are greatest. How do we use that to then engage with companies, as well as with other actors like policymakers, to try and encourage preparation and a greater clarity around policymakers' intentions? And then finally, and I think it is in some ways an additional part, how do we think about the sorts of products, investment strategies and funds that as an industry we should be developing in order to connect capital to solutions in the real world, which fundamentally is the point of asset management. And there are few bigger problems in the real world than nature loss and climate change. And it is certainly an area, I think, where more innovation is needed, whether that's around nature-based solutions, whether that's around other private markets or indeed in public markets, to connect those two things. So I think it's hard to think about it just in terms of specific areas. It does have to be a holistic view of, how do I connect a change that we see in the real world with how we manage investments across the organization?
That's really, really interesting. And you made a really interesting point there about investors are exposed to nature. It's inevitable. You can't avoid it. And I think historically, sometimes people have not accepted that. They have thought that they live in effectively an economic bubble that's detached from nature. And that does feel as though it's a little bit of a shift, which is extremely welcome. When we were talking sort of, prior to this webinar, you and I were chatting a bit about fiduciary duty, and I wondered whether you could just sort of talk about that a little bit, because there's been a degree of debate around, what is an asset manager's sort of a duty to their client, and to what extent should it include things like nature and climate. What's your view on that?
or minefield topics. So I'm not going to attempt to try to define fiduciary or add another definition of fiduciary duty to this discussion as a whole webinar of its own. What I will say is this, that fundamentally, as an asset manager, we have a responsibility to our clients to deliver on their expectations of the portfolios that we're managing. And one thing that as an asset manager unites what pretty much all of our clients are looking for is an expectation of delivering returns and managing risk. And the reality is, for all of the reasons that I've just described, certainly in our view, nature loss and biodiversity pose increasingly important financial and investment risks to investments of all types. And the discussion that we've just been through from Nicole, from Kavita, in terms of the policy change and the changing policy landscape is a really critical part of what's crystallizing an environmental issue, a societal externality, into a financial cost. And that, certainly in our assessment, is going to continue. The challenge isn't going anywhere. And it's important that we prepare today to understand where will those impacts be greatest and how do we most effectively prepare for where the risks will be biggest and identify the opportunities, rather than thinking of it as being something that we can wait until it's happened. It is already happening. It is becoming increasingly financially material. We've already seen those policies begun to become introduced. There is an awful lot more to come. And I think we have a responsibility to understand what that means, how that will impact portfolios, and how we're responsibly managing portfolios for our clients as a result. So, look, I think the words fiduciary duty, a rabbit hole all of its own, but the reality is just as thoughtful, forward-looking asset managers, this should be on all of our agendas.
Yeah, thanks. That's very clear. And I like your risk management framing. And I think that's a very interesting point. And again, conversations I've been having with investors, there's this, we talked about sort of tipping points a little bit. There is a sort of an emotional or a valuation tipping point in the market when suddenly investors really start to take something seriously. They apply potentially a different discount rate to it, or they begin to regard it as something that's near term rather than long term. And that market shift can happen very rapidly. So we're talking about policy shifts, which are happening quite rapidly. Investors and the financial markets move far, far quicker than governments. So as you say, that sort of risk management framing is extremely important. And Nathan, just turning back to you for a second in terms of this sort of broad context. So, the PRI, one of the sort of things that it's trying to do for investors is to help them grapple with some of these issues. What is the PRI doing in the context of sort of nature and maybe the coming together of nature and climate?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So every year, nature has been rising up the list of priority issues for our signatories, and we track that every year. So it sits up alongside human rights and climate, and the three of them go together, we think, and are aligned in many ways. But the level of actual practical action on nature is much less. And so we do have a concern about the readiness of signatories because of the speed of transition that we think governments are going to implement here. And I think the research today bears that out. So the risk of underpricing or mistiming for investors is actually quite high. So we're trying to do some practical things. We try to provide guidance to signatories on how to incorporate nature into their portfolios. So that's guidance on what biodiversity loss is, how to develop a biodiversity investment risk framework. We have built a hub, an online hub, that provides research and resources on the different types of biodiversity management issues that are relevant in different countries, with a lot of work on deforestation, for example. We know that one of our best levers as investors is collaborative engagement, despite the challenges that's facing in some markets right now. And we've worked on deforestation for some years, but we, of course, now have this broader initiative called Spring, which is focusing on deforestation and looking at the countries with the most deforestation exposure and the companies that are critical in those supply chains. We also work on the policy area, and we have something called the Investor Policy Dialogue on Deforestation. And so much of the work between the financial community and policymakers is going to be nuts and bolts type of exchange on, well, what regulation makes a difference and what doesn't, and what can we report on meaningfully, and what information do we need to allocate. And so these types of forums, the IPDD, not that we need another acronym, but these types of forums help that nuts and bolts conversation happen between the investment community and policymakers. The one area where I think we're a bit underdone and we need some more work, is on nature positive solutions, because we know that data availability and the scale of the investment opportunities are sometimes harder to get to, especially in secondary markets, obviously, and because of the transaction costs sometimes involved in alternatives. So we need a bit more effort there across the industry, but in those traditional areas of PRI's work, we've got a lot we can offer.
No, that's really encouraging. And actually, there's a number of sort of investor initiatives around nature which are really beginning to come to the boil. So spring, as you mentioned, there's the Nature Action 100 initiative as well, which has also kicked off and has a well over 200 investors involved in that and a lot of enthusiasm to engage with companies. But just on that sort of collective action, Andy, maybe if I can throw you another slightly controversial curveball, you know, we've seen a degree of sort of pushback, obviously in the US with some particular politicians, but we've seen a number of governments, and Nicole and Kavita's presentation was showing that, you know, not is all rosy in terms of policy moving forward. There've been some sort of reining back. You know, what's your perspective as an asset manager who has to sort of deal with the fluid policy environment around perhaps the politics of ESG, if we want to sort of frame it like that? How's that sort of impacting Schroders, for example?
Look, I think if I've learned anything, questionable, but forecasting politics is probably the trickiest thing. I mean, I think the work obviously that we've just heard about is a huge step forward of making that analytical, but it's very difficult. I think the important thing for me is you step back and look at the challenge, whether it's on climate change, whether it's on nature more broadly. The reality is that these are structural challenges that are getting worse over time, and they're not going to solve themselves. There will be more policy intervention. I don't know when, we don't know the timing, we don't know the details, but we know that over time there will be a response to that. And it's important today that we can prepare for what that response is likely to look like over the longer term. And I think that's the important point from our point of view, is rather than focusing, if you like, on the headlines and the news flow and the sentiment, which fluctuates significantly from month to month, quarter to quarter, year to year, but rather to try and focus on that structural picture. And if you take that back, looking backwards, again, somewhat different topic, but you go back to 2016, you had less than 10% of the world's, about 5% of the world's GDP or emissions were from countries that were committed to becoming net zero by around mid-century. That's about 90% now on either of those two measures. In a relatively short space of time, you've had a significant change. Now, to Nathan's point earlier, we don't have a huge amount of time, so we need to move quickly here, and they are commitments rather than policy action. But the direction of travel taken through a wide lens is reasonably clear in our mind. That will continue. There will continue to be a response to that necessarily, and it's important that we prepare for that rather than trying to gauge what politics will do next week. No, that sounds like a politician's answer. Actually, very impressive. Nathan, do you want to add anything to that from a sort of collective PRI type sort of perspective?
Yeah, I think the politics we've seen around energy transition does risk spilling into agriculture. Investors don't have tractors that they can drive up to parliamentary squares and park in front of the regulators, but we do need to be engaged in this conversation so that policymakers both have some confidence and have a better understanding of how finance is going to step into the transition. This, I believe, will encourage policymakers to provide clearer pathways and transition plans for sectors. We really need to land this, because if you think about just transition issues, sectoral restructuring issues are always hard. We don't want agriculture to end up in years and years of fighting in the way we've had to deal with energy. So yeah, we have to lean into this.
Yeah, thanks. I think, yeah, leaning in is a great way to put it. And I just wanted to bring in Nicole and Kavita, as we're actually getting close to the end of our webinar time. So needing to sort of keep our pedal to the metal. Just in terms of looking forward, I mean, Patricia mentioned the COPs coming up, the one in Colombia around biodiversity, and then of course the COP in Brazil, COP30 in next year. Andy and Nathan, maybe if I start with you and then I can come to Nicole and Kavita for the sort of the policy angle to wrap things up. From an investment perspective, what should investors and maybe companies actually expect from the next 2 years as we go through the biodiversity COP and then the sort of the climate COP, which is going to have perhaps a strong biodiversity angle because it's in Brazil? What should investors and companies be looking for?
I can start off if you like.
Yeah, do.
Yeah, I can start off. So I think just in the way these global frameworks agreements get built out by countries, so are they going to be with the national biodiversity strategy action plans, as they're called. And so investors should look for tightening national commitments over the next 2 years. And although it's not certain that this will play out yet, we've got to remember that there is a target in the global biodiversity framework that calls on companies, transnational businesses, and financial institutions to disclose nature-related risks. I think governments will execute this quite quickly. And so we need to be prepared to have this transparency, and therefore we're going to have to manage these risks as well. So that's something we need to look out for in the investment sector.
Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo that transparency point, the disclosure point. Certainly from where we're sitting, there's going to be an awful lot more information becoming available now. It's going to take a little bit of time for that to settle to a level of consistent, comparable, the sort of data that is easily digestible, but it is going to change quite quickly in many parts of the world. I think the only other thing I'd say is that when we sort of put together biodiversity and climate, I think they are at slightly different points. Certainly my expectation is that around biodiversity, we will see much more clarity of intention, clarity of roadmap, as Nathan says, at a national level and so on. Where we need to get to in climate change, and the next leg here is really much more around the specificities. How will carbon credit markets work? How will voluntary markets work? How will the details play out in practice? Those two things need to converge fairly quickly, but it's the clarity of conviction, of roadmap, of direction that I think is going to be a really critical part within nature.
No, thank you. That's really clear. So Kavita and Nicole, maybe I can give you the last words, and perhaps we'll take it in the order in which you were speaking. So Kavita, maybe you first. You've talked about inevitable policy response. Are there things that investors and maybe companies as well should be sort of campaigning for, pushing for, to try and accelerate the process? What should policy outcomes should people be asking for over the next couple of years? Kavita.
Thank you. Yeah, I see Nathan and Andy picked up on this, but we want to see in the run up to these COPs, biodiversity COPs, is sort of a ramp up in policies, guidelines, action plans for land protection and restoration in line with the global diversity framework. And we will continue to track those and analyze them, sort of after the COPs. Announcements or track announcements and massive scaling of finance for land protection and nature. So we'll continue to track them as well. And then outside of the COP process, following to the EUDR, we'll be looking for increased regulations on deforestation-free supply chains in other regions of the world. We'll track this on a quarterly basis. As we said, we try to distill and cut through all the noise of things shifting day by day, week by week. So it is quarter by quarter. We bring it all together at the end of the year to provide a clear picture of where we are.
That's great. And Nicole, and actually maybe one or both of you might want to comment on this. This report that you produced is obviously very land-based. Oceans extremely important as well in the context of mitigating climate change, and they face the consequences of climate change as well. Are there plans to look at the wet side as well as the dry side?
We are looking at a climate scenario, so we haven't tracked those, but in future we're certainly the biodiversity framework targets are for protection of land and marine ecosystems as well. So great plans for the future. We hope to. Sounds good. Nicole, you get the last word.
It's an amazing pleasure. So I think a few points to mention. One is this is a really strong policy report, but we've already heard in the panel discussion, it's not an island, right? So we see some complementary action, as I mentioned, from the Chinese Stock Exchange. We see it in CSRD and disclosure regulation for the real economy, for the financial services. So the amount of data that will become available on biodiversity impacts, risk, opportunities will increase dramatically. We see the same in terms of what is possible with AI, what is possible with alternative technologies, spatial technologies to understand impacts that we're seeing on nature. So there's we're moving into an entirely new ballgame. And I think if I look at investors and banks, there's a lot that has already happened in the past years in terms of building regional and sectoral intelligence in the context of climate. So just leveraging that, building on that, integrating nature, biodiversity, as has been mentioned, is exactly the way to move ahead. Because in this context, again, we see the strong dependence on both. And that is going to open up, I think, a new view also on what can be done in the global south, also in terms of market development and potential, which is then complementary to what policymakers can help support in terms of market framing, credibility, trust in new systems.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, look, it just remains for me to say a huge thank you to our panelists, to our speakers, and particularly to Patricia, our keynote speaker, who's actually had to go off to another meeting, and to all of you for dialing in. Thank you for your time. You can catch up with this webinar on the Planet Tracker YouTube channel. It'll be filed up there at some stage tomorrow. You can download the IPR report from their website. And it's also worth flagging that coming up in April, there's another webinar that you might be interested in, where the IPR and the PRI are holding their first investor briefing for 2024. And that will be on Tuesday, April the 12th at 2 p.m. GMT, so same time that this webinar was on as well. That's it from all of us. Thank you very much indeed for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.